So when it says Jesus is coming into the world, there's actually more than meets the eye with this statement that he is coming into the world. In Hebraic thought, in Jewish thought, especially at the time of Jesus in the first century, the coming one was a term or a nickname, we may say, for the Messiah. The coming one equaled the Messiah. John is later on going to ask Jesus, are you the one who is to come? Or should we look for another? In John chapter 6, verse 14, people are declaring that Jesus is truly the prophet who has come into the world. Picking up on that theme, we see this thought of the coming one equaling the Messiah being rooted in scriptures like Psalm 118, verse 36. We all love this scripture. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And also Psalm 40, verse 7, this prophetic passage where it says, behold, I come. It is written about me in your scroll. Behold, I come. And Malachi 3, verse 1, the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple. Even the messenger of the covenant whom you delight, behold, he is coming. So that's a major passage there relating to the coming one, equaling the Messiah. And of course, Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9 also says, rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion, shout aloud, O daughter Jerusalem, lo, your king comes to you. Triumphant and victorious is he, humble and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. So all of these passages point to the coming of the Messiah and that nature that he is the coming one, the one that we are expecting. So now we have John, the beloved, declaring the coming one, the one that has been promised for so long. The coming one has come at last. He is here. And so what a glorious thought that the Creator himself, who spoke light into existence, now invades his own creation by coming into the very world that he made. He's invading the creation that he himself made. The hope of the ages has arrived, and the light is shining upon all mankind.
Notice what happens. Look in your text, if you would, at verses 10 and 11. For time's sake, we won't read them again, but notice what happens. We find that even though the Creator has come into this world that he himself created, there's some that are not going to recognize him, right? Not going to know him. So although unrecognized and even rejected, okay? Even rejected by some, here what do we find John doing? He continues to reiterate Jesus' role as the Creator. Folks, whether people acknowledge him or not, he is still the Creator. He's not up on his throne worried because how evolution has spread. He's not worried about that. He is on his throne. Nothing's going to shake the truth. Whether people acknowledge or don't acknowledge, he's the Creator nonetheless. And this is what John's really trying to say here. So even though the world was made by him, many may have failed to recognize him even though he's come into this world that he's made. Now notice what happens in verse number 10. On the heels of the first occurrence of this word in verse number 9, we find John is going to begin to emphasize this word, the world. Everybody say the world. The world. Now, when you and I think about the world, we're thinking about the globe, aren't we? We're thinking about Earth. When we talk about the world, that's normally what we think of. Now, the Greek word behind our English word is cosmos. Some would pronounce it cosmos, but it's cosmos. You want to try it with me? Cosmos. Let's do it again. Cosmos. Right? So again, the Greek word here is cosmos. So he's coming into this cosmos which he created. Now, if you want to write this down, it's pretty staggering. John, just in his gospel, the Gospel of John, uses this term 78 times. 78 times in the Gospel of John, we find this word cosmos, which we translate world. Hey, you know, that's pretty amazing. When you think of one word occurring over and over and over, it's virtually on every page. So, if John's going to use a word cosmos 78 times, hey, you know, it just makes sense for us to make sure we understand what he's talking about every time he uses this word. Very, very important here. Now, in John's gospel, the basic sense of the world is to be understood as the realm where human beings dwell. okay, or the world of humanity. Now, interestingly enough, in most cases, when we come across this word cosmos or world in the Gospel of John, it's used in a bit of a negative way. It's not always a positive image that we find. Because, see, in John's Gospel, most often it's used to refer to the portion of creation, or the portion of humanity, maybe we should say, that's living in rebellion against God. How you know all you have to do is walk out your front door to realize this truth? But what's so staggering, it's to this world that by and large has rejected, this world that by and large is living in total opposition of the goodwill of God, it's this world that the Word, the Logos, Jesus has come to save. John 3:16, we don't have to wait long. Jesus is having a really good discussion with a guy by the name of Nicodemus. You've heard of him, you know him, right? And remember, there's this great theological discussion that's going on, and Jesus said, "For God so loved this world," yep, this world that is fallen, this world that is far from perfect, this world that by and large doesn't want to have anything to do with a holy and righteous God. It's this world that God has sent His Son into. For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, so that whoever would believe in Him would not perish, but have everlasting life. For God did not send His Son into the world to judge or condemn the world, but that the world through Him might have life. Here we are. What's the source of life? According to John chapter 1, it's the Logos. It's the Word. So again, when we come across this word cosmos, world, in the Gospel of John, we have to remember it's not always a pretty picture. But that's why He's left us here. That's why He came. Like Michelle said, Jesus said, "While I'm in the world, I'm the light of the world. But when I go away, guess what? You are the light of the world." And remember, as we said in our last session, that light that shone so long ago at creation, it still shines. It still shines through you and I as we bear witness to the truth of this gospel. This message can bring light into the darkness. So what have we got to do? We don't run away from the darkness. We run into the darkness and we let that light shine. Because it's to that darkness, to that world that Christ has called us, that He Himself even entered into. So notice what happens in that final clause, that final portion of verse number 10. Look what it says, and it says, "And the world," the cosmos, "did not know Him." Did not know Him. Now maybe your translations are showing some variation here. It's common to translate this word, know, as recognize. How many of you have that in your translations? Wave at me. Give me a big wave so I can see you out there. Okay, so several of you. Anything else going on in the translations out there other than know or recognize in the last part of verse 10? Anything else? Okay, that should be about it. Those are generally the two main ways this word's translated. Now again, here we're faced really with a sad reality, aren't we, when we look at verse number 10. Here, the Word who's brought creation about comes into this world, which is His own, but it did not know Him. And that's the best translation. See, more than a few people of that world didn't know their Creator when He came and was literally among them. And I'd say the same thing, by and large, still holds true. Even though you can go into work, you can go to school, you can let your light shine, you can proclaim the good news, you can live it, but yet still people continue to what? Reject, or at least not acknowledge or recognize Him as the Creator. Now, as Borchert points out, he gives a great quote here, and he says, Western Christians, that's people like us, okay, that live in the West. Western Christians generally have lived with the concept of knowing as primarily related to the sphere of intellectual information. When we think of knowledge, what are we thinking? We're thinking of a head knowledge, okay? We're thinking of a head knowledge. But we need to recognize that such a definition is a far cry from John's meaning of knowing. See, knowing in the Gospel of John is a relational idea. See, knowing the Logos in this Gospel is more than knowing facts about the Logos. How many of you know that God's called us to do just more than know about Him with the head knowledge? We all get that, don't we? Yeah, we get that. See, it's more than just knowing facts about Jesus, Again, let's not forget all the way back in Genesis, which we're always supposed to keep in the back of our mind at this point in the Gospel of John, when God created man on this earth, he created him to have a personal, intimate relationship, right? And then we know the story of what happens. Sin enters into the picture, but God stays committed to making that relationship work, right? Remember, man ran away from God, blew it, rejected God's goodwill, went and hid away. And God had to come down and say, where are you? And we all know, we were talking about this with somebody just the other day, it's not like there was a bush that Adam and Eve were hiding behind that God didn't know about. It's not that he didn't know where they were. He's trying to draw them back into a relationship with him. He wanted them to know his character. He wanted them to know that they could have restoration, that God wasn't going to be just ready to give up on them when they failed. How do you know that's shouting ground? You know what I'm talking about? You ever failed God? You failed God before you got saved, and I'll bet you still fail God from time to time. Maybe more than we'd like to admit. Don't act so smug. You know it's true. Come on. But aren't you glad that we've got some great passages in this biblical text that remind us that God he's committed to this relationship. He is. He wants us to know him through experience. And part of that experience involves what? Salvation and restoration when we fall. So again, there's a world that rejects, right? And there's a world that, again, fails to acknowledge or know him in an intimate way. Notice verse 11. Let's put it all together now. It says, he came to his own. He came to his own, or his own property, or he came to his own home, maybe we could translate. So he's coming to his own world that he created, and then notice what happens, but yet they fail to recognize. Now again, a lot of people, if you read various commentaries and you talk to people, a lot of times people say that this refers to the Jewish nation, that the Jewish nation, he came to them and they rejected him, and so he chose the Gentiles, or us Christians. Have you heard that before? He comes across pulpits all the time, comes on television all the time, it's in books, everywhere you look, it's that way, it is. Is this what he's talking about? Everybody nod your head like this, shake it from side to side, say, no. No, it's not talking about that the Jewish people rejected him. Last time I checked, Jesus came, his audience was completely Jewish, and not everybody rejected him, folks, right? He's got a handful of disciples. He's got many that are going to follow him. And when we look at the Gospel of John, we find a phenomenon that plays out that we still see on a day-to-day basis. Some are going to acknowledge him, and others are going to what? Not acknowledge him. And that's just the way this life is. Don't you think wouldn't it be great if everybody we shared our faith with and explained the gospel to and took time with got on the Jesus wagon and they just believed and lived faithfully? Don't you think that'd be great? But have you know that's just not the way it is. It's just not. But again, the true beauty of this is the Lord knows that not everyone is going to accept him, yet he still comes. This is the truth we walk away with. Even though he knows not all will acknowledge. And remember, he's the creator. He's responsible for all life. And yet he's still committed to coming and saving this world. It's a great, great truth. So again, it's talking here about he came to the world of men. He came to humanity, to people in general, and they didn't by and large accept him. Because how do you know, all you have to do is start reading in the book of Acts as Paul goes and he leaves the Jewish soil, the soil of Israel, and he begins to go out into that Greco-Roman world where pagans are. And how many of you know that he has a lot of problems in a lot of places? They try and kill him. They put him in prison. And yeah, those are not Jewish people oftentimes that are persecuting him and rejecting him, but it's people like us, non-Jews. So again, when we read this text, we have to just remember that it's here talking about humanity in general. Humanity in general is going to reject. Now look at verses 12 and 13. Notice, but the emphasis doesn't stay on those that reject, does it? And we mentioned this last week. Folks, if you or I, for 1 minute, get our eyes on people that are not going to accept and that reject, we're going to be discouraged most days. We can't put our attention on people that don't accept the gospel. We've got to keep our attention on those who do accept. Okay? Be encouraged tonight. Keep sharing your faith. Keep shining that light. Don't get discouraged when people reject. Hey, if the Creator himself came and not everybody recognized, who do we think we are? You know what I'm talking about? So pull your shoulders back, keep plugging away, and stay faithful and keep your eyes on those that are accepting. So notice what happens in verses 12 through 13. We won't read them since we've already done so. But the focus is not upon those who fail to believe, but on those who choose to believe. How many of you, we've got a choice in this? That's just the way God set it up. Amazing as it is, we have a choice in this. Those who choose to believe in his name, he gave the right. Or maybe your translation reads, a better way to translate this is, he gave the authority to become children of God. Have you know no man can give you authority to become a child of God? Not going to happen. Doesn't matter what a preacher says about you. It doesn't matter what another individual says about you. God and God alone is responsible for what? Making you or I a child of God. And this is what this verse is really stressing. So this phrase, believing in his name, it's a pretty rare phrase, actually. We only see it in the works of John. We see it in the Gospel of John, and we see it in 1 John, okay, which most likely is the same person's responsible for both these works. But it's to accept Jesus to the fullest extent of who he is, okay? That's what belief is. It's not something we say with our mouth. No, we believe in Jesus. We trust in him to the fullest extent of who he is. That's what allows us to become a child of God. And notice what happens. To those who receive the word, he himself gives the right to become God's children. Now we know in the first century that there were some Jewish people, not all, but some Jewish people thought they were children of God simply by means of being born in the lineage of Abraham. Remember, John the Baptist comes along. Jesus will later echo his words, but John the Baptist looks at a very religious crowd and says, don't think that just because you are Abraham's seed that you're right with God or that you're children of God. Remember, Jesus is going to have to stress to Nicodemus, the great teacher of Israel, the Pharisee of Pharisees. He's going to say, you must be born again. And you remember Nicodemus' response? Well, Jesus, how exactly can I do that? I can't go back into my mother's womb and be born again. What are you talking about? And Jesus is talking about a spiritual birth. Hey, you know we've got to have a spiritual birth. And the only one that can bring about that spiritual birth that allows us to become a child of God is God himself. So as we put our trust and we believe in him, he, not any man, gives the authority to become a child of God. A child of God. Let's never forget what a great honor it is just to be a child of God. More than any specific calling, more than any great thing that the Lord may ever allow us to be a part of, the thing that ought to strum the chords of our heart more than anything is being reminded that we have been given the right by his grace. Nothing we've done. All we had to do is choose to believe, to look at the evidence and believe. And then God himself gives the authority for us to become a child of God. It's amazing. It just is amazing. Now notice what happens in verse number 14. We're going to move on and we find a little bit of a shift. You probably noticed it as we're reading our text. With this verse, if you want to write this down, we're moving from the book of Genesis to the book of Exodus. We're moving from Genesis to Exodus. Okay? Now, if you open up the Bible and you start in the beginning, we've got the book of Genesis. And then we've got the book of Exodus. Everybody say Exodus. You read that one before? What's the book of Exodus all about in a nutshell? It's about a people in bondage that God brings out with his mighty hand, delivers sacred instructions to them on how to walk with him, and then he shows that he's a faithful provider and that he preserves them in that salvation and he brings them through the desert, obviously on their way into the promised land. So it's a book about liberation. It's a book about freedom. It's a book about deliverance. It's a book that's all about redemption. Okay? And now you remember in the book of Exodus, God was with his people out there in the wilderness, wasn't he? He didn't leave them alone. He didn't just send them on out or just do a pretty incredible thing there at the Red Sea and then say, see you on the other side. That's not what he said, did he? Even though he does the same thing with us, he's not going to leave us. He's not going to save us and then go on, do the best you can. Hope to see you later. He's with us, right? He is Emmanuel. He is the God who's with us. And so we find what happens is God stays in the midst of his people all that time of their wilderness journeys, doesn't he? So in light of all that, let's go back and let's look at verse number 14. We're going to find the Word becomes flesh and he dwells among us. So verse number 14, and the Word became flesh and he tabernacled is the best translation, or he tented among us. And we have seen his glory, the glory of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. Folks, we've got some incredible things that are going on in verse number 14. We just do. So everybody act like you're shifting gears in a car. We're going from first gear Genesis to second gear Exodus. And we want to highlight about 5 things here in just the next couple minutes. And we may not make it to all of it, but let's at least get started. Look at what happens. The first declaration, the Word, and who's the Word again? Jesus, becomes flesh. This is what we refer to as the incarnation. Okay, the incarnation. It's a Latin term, okay? Incarnation. Now again, what John's really stressing here is that eternal Logos, who is not a part of creation but is the Creator, is now in some incredible way going to step out, or maybe we should say step into flesh. He's going to literally become man in some mysterious way. Remember, the very one who's created man is now going to what? Become a man. So John stresses that the eternal Word, the Logos, became human, truly human. And that is a great mystery. But notice it doesn't end there. Look at what happens. Where does he make his dwelling? He took on a human body. He took on flesh. And where does he make his dwelling? He makes his dwelling among the realm of men. It says he made his dwelling. Literally, it's he tabernacled or he tented among us. A couple things we want to talk about here. When we think of Exodus, again, we're thinking of the time when the Jewish people, they dwelled in what? Tabernacles or tents out in the wilderness, right? But they weren't the only ones that were dwelling in a tent out there. Somebody else was dwelling in a tent. Who was it? Jim Bob from across the street? No, who was it? God. God was in the very midst of them. Remember, he gave specific instructions on how the camps were to arrange their tribal tents. But God said, I want to be right in the middle. Right in the middle. Right in the center. And if anybody ever wonders if I'm here, all they've got to do is look up and there's a what? There's a cloud of glory. There's a cloud of glory, and no one would ever have to doubt if God was with them. They didn't have to trust their feeler. Oh, is God with? He's with us. There he is. There's his cloud by day. There's the fire by night. So we've got all this tent imagery, this Exodus imagery. And if we look at this word here in Greek for tented, now, if we look over into the Hebrew Bible, remember Genesis was originally written in Hebrew, but later on it was translated over into Greek. We call it the Septuagint, okay? But if we take this Greek word and we put it back into Hebrew like it originally was, okay? It's the same word that's used, again, of God's tabernacle there that was there in the midst of the people back in Exodus. It's also the same word that we get. We bring it straight over, really, from English, and we say Shekinah. Shekinah. Shekinah is how you say it in Hebrew. There used to be a great bookstore here in town years ago called Shekinah. Do you know what the Shekinah is? It's God's visible presence, or literally his glory. So notice what John says here. The Word became flesh. He tented. He tabernacled among us, and we have beheld his what? His glory. What glory do you think he's talking about? That same glory that was with the people in the wilderness? Now God, in an incredible way, is in the person of Jesus. And he's here and he's walking this earth. Even though he may not be here physically anymore, but his glory is still here. Paul said to the Corinthians, you are the temple of God. God's presence dwells in you and I. That's a mysterious truth, friend. I can't get my head around it. I know it to be true, but have you thought about that lately? Have you just taken one of those Selah moments and said, God's glory is in me? The glory of God in some mysterious way is residing in me as the tent of God. And you know the story. The tabernacle was later replaced by a more permanent structure called the temple. So when Paul says, you are the temple of God, everybody got what he was talking about. So again, what an amazing truth that the very glory of God that had once been with the people in the wilderness, leading them, guiding, showing them direction, which step to take, was now there in the form of Jesus. And I'd suggest to you now, in a mysterious way, as we said, dwells within each and every one of us to guide us and lead us every step of the way. Aren't you glad you don't have to figure this life out on your own? You don't have to make all the decisions yourself. Aren't you glad about that? That just like God, whenever that glory cloud moved, guess what? Israel was to pack up their little pup tent and start walking. And when God stopped, they stopped. When he moved, they moved. That's how I want to live my life. Is that how you want to live your life? Following God's leading and guiding, it's a great truth. So when he says, we have seen his glory, what an incredible thing.